Welcome to my 18th century undergarment series. Today I'm going to be working on my stays. Now for me, this was by far the most intimidating part of the process the first time around. Ultimately, they did end up being a bit easier than I thought they would be, but that was mostly because I had really built them up in my head to be something terribly difficult. Hopefully this video helps you just get started, because for me, once I got started, things were a lot easier than I was expecting. I made my first stays a few months ago. I used Simplicity 8162. I was honestly very happy with how these turned out. I know they weren't historically accurate, but they really worked for me. And honestly, if I wasn't making this video series, I probably would just go with these for my next project. But as it is, I want to make sure that I give you as much information as possible, and that includes making your stays. So we're going to be starting all this all over again. But I did learn a lot while I made them, so hopefully that helps me this time around. Now, one thing I do want to say real fast is I'm not aiming for historical accuracy. I want these to be accessible to everybody. I want them to be inexpensive. I want this to be an approachable process. I also want to run to as few stores as possible. So you're going to be noticing that I did buy a lot of my materials at Joann's or at Home Depot. Those were actually the two main places I went, because that's just what was easiest for me. So before we get started, I just want to talk about the materials that go beyond the basics of just your needle, your thread, your sewing machine. First off, I have my Simplicity pattern, 8579. This is a pattern I've been using for the rest of my series, so it really shouldn't be any surprise that I'm using this. I already have my pattern cut out from my first video of this series. You can see the binder clip is still on there, which I was very grateful for. This whole thing actually ended up falling off my cutting table while I was working on my last commission, and it fell into the mess of clutter that lives underneath my sewing table usually. So I was very grateful I only had to find this instead of having to dig through and find all four pieces, which would have probably taken a while. Now I'm planning to slightly alter my pattern. I want it to be a front opening. You can see here it's all one piece, so you kind of have to either wiggle into them or have somebody lace them at the back. I'm planning on probably dressing myself for this, so I'm going to do a front opening to make that a little bit easier. So I have my fabric here. I actually lost my receipt for this, so I'm not entirely sure what the store was calling this. It's a fairly heavy utility fabric. I found it next to the muslins in Joann's. And I saw it and I thought, hey, why not? I also have this fairly thin cotton for my fashion fabric. I bought this off of Amazon. Now, I'm incredibly shallow when it comes to my projects. If it doesn't look pretty, I'm not going to feel particularly inclined to finish it. So I found this on Amazon. I know it's not an 18th century approved design, but no one's going to see this, and it makes me happy, so that's good enough. Now you're going to notice I'm not planning on lining my stays. That's a personal preference. I just don't think it's a necessary step, so I'm skipping it. What you would do is you would line your stays as the last step of the process. So it'd be after you bind your tabs and everything. Normally the lining would be removed, and that would be what gets, actually you wouldn't even wash it. You would just throw it away and make a new one. I'm wearing because of my shift and everything, the stays are going to be fairly safe from, just my body oils and sweat, so I'm not worrying about it too much. I'm trying to make this process easier and a little bit quicker for me, so I'm choosing not to line my stays. Now, one thing you will notice is that we are not using Cortile here. That's for a couple of reasons. First off, I'm not even sure it was invented yet. But secondly, you really don't need it. For stays, your support comes from your boning, not from your fabric. You do want to have fairly sturdy fabric, but you really don't need the stiffness that Cortile would give you. So what we have here should work without any problems. Speaking of support, let's talk boning. Now, I'm choosing to work with cable ties. I used these for my last pair of stays, and I was very happy with them. They were easy to work with. Now, I'm not usually a plastic girl. I usually try and shy away from any kind of plastic boning. I usually prefer to use steel in my corsets or in my dresses. But for stays, I definitely go with these. The problem with steel is that it gets very heavy, and the problem with how heavily boned these stays are, especially because I am doing fully boned stays, that would just kind of make things a lot heavier than I want to go for. So I'm going with the cable ties. These are actually a pretty good baleen substitute. If you really want to, you could go with reed. I'm just a little paranoid when it comes to reed. I'm always afraid they're going to break, especially in the tabs. So I'm choosing to not put myself through that kind of stress. And I'm just going to go with the plastic cable ties. So I have my Dremel tool here, and I'm going to use this to sand down the edges of my boning once I cut it. You can use sandpaper, but this is easier. So I would go with this if you have one. I don't expect you to have one, but if you do, it's a good option. Okay, now for my straps, I have this 1-inch wide twill tape. I bought this off of Cheap Trims a long time ago. I'm pretty sure they do still have it. It's going to make things a lot easier for your straps. I loved them when I made my last pair, so I'm going to be going with this again. To finish off my stays, I have this extra wide double fold bias tape. I have a few packs of these because I am planning on covering my seams as well as binding the top and the bottom. You could be historically accurate and use leather. That's not what I'm going for. I'm just gonna go with this because I have it on hand. It's easier. It's easy to use, and once again, I don't really care if this is going to be perfectly accurate. The last thing I have here to help with the binding process is a little bit of Stitch Witchery. Actually, I think this is just like a knockoff brand of Stitch Witchery that I got in like a sewing kit a couple years ago. I know it still works, so that's fine. It's just a nice little fusible webbing. I'm hoping that this is going to help me sew my tabs. It's a trick that Red Threaded uses, and I'm hoping that it'll make the binding process a little less painful. It wasn't that bad, but a lot of it was done by hand, and I did kind of wish that mine turned out a little bit better. And as of right now, I'm kind of toying with the idea of trying to bind my tabs by machine. I don't know if that's actually what's gonna happen, so we'll see. So anyway, these are just the basic supplies. So I'm gonna cut out my fabric, and I'm going to get to work. I have all my pieces cut out now. I just wanted to talk about what I did real fast before I sew in these boning channels. First off, you're going to notice that I did not cut out my tabs. Instead, I just kind of cut a big chunk of fabric around them, and I just drew in my lines. This is really just so I have a little bit more to work with. I'm not, hopefully it won't be as finicky as having the tabs cut out. I haven't actually tried this method yet, so this may end up being a disaster, but at least I know I tried. Second, you'll see that I did draw on my boning channels just to give myself a guide, make my life a little bit easier. And the last thing I did, because I'm not using a lining for my stays, I did pink the edges of my seams just to hopefully prevent fraying a little bit. We'll see how that works out. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to sew along my tab line, and I'm going to sew in my boning channels. Okay, so now that this is done, I am going to just repeat these steps with all the rest of my stay pattern pieces. Let me think, there should be 7 more to go. So, I'll see you in a bit. So my boning channels are all sewn now. So the next step is going to be to finish my center front and center back and sew everything together. I already finished one side here. So it's all sewn together. The front and the back are finished. And I also took some cross grain ribbon and I sewed it over my seams for a little, just for a little decorative touch, and also to reinforce those seams a little bit. I did the ribbon, I stitched down the ribbon by hand, but everything else was by machine because of time. It's just a lot faster that way. So now I'm going to take this over to my machine, finish the front and back, sew up the side seams, and then I'm going to hand sew the ribbon, and then we'll be ready to bind. So I have my front piece here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to fold this over where my first boning channel is. And then I am going to stitch close to the edge here, right over my stitches. And I'm going to also stitch over the next row of stitches as well, just for extra reinforcement. So that's going to hold that down nicely and give me a nice secure front. There we are. And now I'm going to repeat the same steps on the back center here. So it's going to be the part where, let me turn it over so you can actually see. So it's not going to be the side with the curve. It's going to be right here, the other side. I'm just going to stitch that down. I'm going to stitch down probably both of the 2 boning channels after it, just to make sure I hold it down. So one option you have is you could do your eyelets now, and honestly I probably should have done that by now, but I am going to hold off on that just because I already have the other side done, and I'm already at my machine, so I might as well just stitch the rest up. Now it would possibly be easier to do your eyelets now as opposed to later, but why would we do things the easy way, right? Gotta see my edges here, and I'm going to just line those up. I'm going to sew at 5/8 of an inch. I'm going to continue that for the other 2 pieces. So I'm going to line up the edge and stitch up. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to press all my seams flat. And then I'm going to go back and I'm going to press them all open. I'm also going to make sure I press my edges where I finished off the front and back. That's the front. Alright, so I have my presser hand, and I am going to press all my seams open. You probably don't need a presser hand for this part, but whenever I press my seams open, I always do it over the ham. Just makes it easier for me. So now I'm sewing a little bit of grosgrain ribbon over my seams. In theory, this should reinforce them a little bit. I don't know how much reinforcement's actually going on with mine because of the way I'm sewing it on, but I'm doing my best. So there you go. So it's just going to cover it up nicely there. Now I'm not being particularly careful of how I'm sewing this on. I'm just kind of doing this quickly so I can get it done. You may, if you are doing this, you may want to make your stitches a little less visible than mine. You might want to choose a different method to sew this on, but this is just a nice, quick and easy method for me. So what I'm doing is I'm taking my needle, I'm grabbing just a little bit of my fashion fabric. I'm being careful not to sew through the whole end because this is a boning channel. I don't want to interfere with that. So I'm just taking a small bit of my fashion fabric, and I am bring my needle up through the ribbon and pulling that through. And I'm going to just keep repeating this until I get to the end. Again, just the fashion fabric and the ribbon right on the edge. So I bound the bottom of half of my stays, and doing this made me really want to start a support group for people who are binding stays, because this was not fun. I did end up doing it by machine. It actually didn't turn out as bad as I thought it would. It could have been way worse, especially because I've never really done it that way before. But like I said, it was not fun. It was not easy, but it was potentially faster than doing it by hand, even though I did have to go back and fix a couple of mistakes. I will say that binding, sewing over it to bind the back, to attach the back of the binding, that went way more smoothly than last time, because last time I did do that part by hand. Doing it by machine went way faster. Getting it on it, getting the front on it though, that wasn't fun. And now I get to do it one more time, because, I only did half the stays. Anyway, they're not all that pretty on the back. But they're gonna get the job done, and they're not gonna be in my way too much, so I can't complain too much. So if you also want to be crazy and buying your stays by machine, I have just, a couple of tips. First off, I put my knee lift in just to make life a little bit easier because there's so many turns. And of my bias tape, I pressed it flat. And I trimmed the one end down to about 1/4 inch. Just because if there's a little less fabric, hopefully it's a little bit easier. I did try doing it with the full tab on one side, and it wasn't fun. So I trimmed this bit down, and it made things a little bit easier. It still wasn't fun, but yeah, it did make it a little bit easier. Alright, so let's get started on the second half. Yay! One thing I want to mention before I start sewing on the binding is I did clip back the bottom of my stays just to make life a little bit easier. And just one more thing I want to add: when you are adding your binding, you do want to make sure that the tabs of the other parts of your stays aren't getting caught under it. I had to unpick a lot of my binding last time because I was stuck like this. Alright, so let's get started. So we're going to line the binding up against the very edge of the stitching that we did along the bottom of our stays. So back stitch. Now the key with this is to go very slowly, and you also want to lift your pressure foot up and pivot a lot. Okay, so now you're going to lift your pressure foot up. You're going to pivot the stays to a 90-degree angle, and you're going to try and position your bias to go straight along that 90-degree angle. Now the key is you don't want to get any part of your binding caught between your needle and your binding, because then you end up with a weird pucker. But that is easier said than done. Worst comes to worst, you can always unpick the weird pucker, and then you can re-stitch it once the rest of your binding's on. Which I had to do multiple times on my last pair, on the last half of my stays. Put it back down and continue on. I'm really debating on if this is actually faster than doing this by hand. I just caught the edge. I'll pick that later. Alright, and back down. I just got the edge again. And my thread just broke. Okay, well, I'm gonna do a little jump in a second, and I'm just gonna come back when I get when the binding is all sewn on. Alright, so I have the bulk of my binding on now. Don't worry, you didn't miss anything other than my bobbin running out halfway through and having to redo the whole thing. But just before we get on to the next step, I want to show you a couple of the mistakes I made. Alright, so first off, there is this point right here that I was working on right before I turned the video off. This is right where the binding got caught between the edge of my binding and the needle. So that's what that ended up looking like. So I'm going to have to pick that apart. And then over here, the raw edge of my binding ended up on the wrong side of my stitching. So I'm going to have to stitch that apart. I'm going to have to pick that apart too. Luckily though, not too many mistakes happened. So that's going to be pretty easy to fix. So I'm just going to get my seam ripper. And I'm just going to pick that apart. So I can just free those edges there. And this is something you can correct either by hand or by machine. I haven't decided which way I'm doing it yet, so it's going to be pretty spontaneous when I finish this. Let's see. There we go. Bingo. Alright, so I'm just going to tuck that in there. I'll fix that in a second. Actually, no, I'm going to fix it now while I'm thinking of it. That way I don't make the same mistake twice. So I think I'm going to do this one by machine. There we go. So now you can see that part is all fixed. So moving on to the puckered bit. Alright. So I'm going to fix this part by hand because I think it's going to be kind of hard to get in there. Okay, so now that we have this all sewn on and we fixed all the problem areas, we're just going to trim this back a bit, right to that line that we stitched earlier. Now you want to try and make this cut as smooth as possible, because this is going to determine the edge of your stays. So if it's all wonky, then your stays, the binding on your stays is going to look all wonky. So let's see. Try and make sure that you guys can see. Not that I don't think you don't know how to cut things. Because the stays in my binding are only 1/4 inch wide, I'm going to have a really narrow edge on mine once it's all done. You can see here. You may not want it to be that narrow. You may want it to be that narrow. It's completely up to you. I don't know what the historically accurate guidelines are. Mine are just going to end up being pretty narrow, and that's okay with me. Let's see, cut this side now. I'm also going to trim my ribbon a bit. Keep hearing me hit some paper here. That's because my makeshift tripod is really just a tube of paper. So I apologize if you hear any rustling. For the bit that's in between the two tabs, we're just going to cut that straight up to 1/4 inch. I know you probably can't see that well. I'm sorry. Let's see. Alright, so I'm just going to keep trimming this around, and I'll be back with you in a second. So for this next step, we're going to just ease the bias around the curve, and we're going to press it. So let's see. It's another one of those times where it's definitely easier to not have your boning in yet. Like I said earlier, that might not be a luxury you have, depending on which way your boning channels are. Mine are mostly vertical, so they open at the top and the bottom, so it doesn't really matter for me. But depending on your stays pattern, you may not have a choice but to do this after you bone your stays. At this point, I probably won't be able to talk about boning the stays until the next video, because this one might be getting a little long. But we'll see. Alright, so just going to curve it under. Give it a press. Not super pretty, but it's getting the job done. So I'm really just focused on the front seam right here, pressing that part down. I'm not going to concern myself too much with the back just yet. I'm going to actually flip it before I worry about that. I do want to make sure that the stitches here get pressed. Alright, so I'm just going to go around. I'm going to press the back down. So that's what it's going to look like from the front. Again, could be a bit prettier, but I can deal with that. That's not a big deal to me. Nobody's going to see these. It is what it is. Alright, so just before I take these over to my sewing machine, I'm going to do a quick little trick. I'm going to take some stitch witchery and I'm going to put it underneath the tops of these curves just to keep them in place. Like I said, not historically accurate at all, but I like to think that if this was an option that they could have had back then, they would have taken it. Alright, so I'm just going to stick that under here. And that's nice and secure. I'm going to continue that underneath all of these. Now we're at the part where it's definitely easier to do it by machine, and that's just stitching along the top. We're just going to kind of stitch in the ditch here between the bias and the stays, and it should catch the back of here nicely. So let's see. So just like last time, you do a small stitch length, go nice and slow. There we go. So there we go. Done way faster than if I had to do it by hand. No, it's gonna hold. I'm pretty happy with how it turned out. Is it the prettiest way of doing this? No. But you know what? It was effective. So the inside's ugly, but you know what? I can deal with that. If I really wanted to, I could put a lining in here and just cover up the extra bits of unpleasantness here, but it's not a big enough deal for me. Alright, so I'll see you guys in the next video when we're going to finish these up. See ya!